Thanks so much, Mark. Thank you for everybody for being here today too. Really appreciate. We changed the time and the location. We normally do this in the evening, and we normally do it in my district on the west side. This year, we purposely did it during lunchtime. We really focused this town hall really to our advocacy, to the great advocacy organizations that are here in the Bay Area. So really appreciate everybody for coming out. I just want to remind everyone how I think of our budget and really what I think of when it comes to what are the main goals of our state budget. And our state budget, to me, is really about making sure that we are protecting and taking care of the most vulnerable people in our state. If you look at, and I'm going to go through a few slides, really the bulk of where our funding is, that really is the ultimate goal. And what we saw right before I got to the legislature, right about when Christian started as chief consultant in 2008, as you'll recall, that we had the Great Recession. And during that Great Recession, we saw devastating cuts to our social safety net, some of which we literally just put back the money a year or two ago. We're talking about devastating cuts to CalWorks, devastating cuts to Medicare. We didn't see rate increases for Medicare. I know there are a number of child care advocates here, child care, and we could just go on and on. So my not saying your particular issue or not is not reflective of that's not a priority. It's just we saw so many unfortunate cuts. And so what we really set our budget up to do as the economy came back, as revenue came back, was to really be very thoughtful about what we committed to and making sure that in the next downturn that we could stay committed to it, meaning that we didn't want to see devastating cuts through K12 education or devastating cuts through higher education or early ed. We wanted to make sure that that commitment remained. And so that's why we structured the reserve. That's why we went to all of you as voters to pass the rainy day fund. That's why we asked all of you to really give us the power to pass a majority budget. Before I got there, the budget had to be passed by 2/3 supermajority, so we could always get held hostage by one Republican or two Republicans and have to do some crazy things to get the budget, just to get the budget passed. You see what's happening in DC, where you have people holding up the budget and not paying bills. And it's really awful because they passed the budget and they're basically saying, well, we passed the budget and we want you to spend all this money on all these things, but we're not going to let the Department of Treasury actually pay their bills, which I think is a really awful way to run a government. It's an awful way to run any kind of fiscal policy. So for us, we really try to do something different. I think the other thing that we try to do is we made sure the ongoing spending was very focused on items that we really cared about and were major priorities, and then everything else, which is really roughly about 80%. Like for the last few years, we've had some surpluses. For the last few years, what we've done is about 80% of that new money would be on what I call one-time spending. And one-time spending are things that we would maybe commit to a year or two. I would say we focus a lot on infrastructure, capital, knowing that we were getting closer and closer to a downturn. We said it's a great time to focus on infrastructure. So what's infrastructure? Like deferred maintenance. We have a lot of deferred maintenance in the state buildings. We have a lot of deferred maintenance in the universities. A great time to do all of that work is actually as the economy starts slowing down. It's a great time because the construction crews are not employed for all the new development. It's a great time to do all those repairs. It's a great time to build. It's also why we advocated for, I led our house, the Assembly's house, and really advocating for billions of dollars for transit funding. We got billions of dollars last year in transit funding. You're going to see in the speaker's press release that goes out soon, and my press release that goes out soon, a reminder to the governor that there was $2 billion cut out of transit funding that we're going to keep fighting for. So that's absolutely a major priority for us. So that's something that we're very focused on because again, it's capital, and it's something that if we can't funded in year 3 or 4, we have different opportunities to try to turn that off or turn that on. Also, again, one of the major priorities that wasn't something that was there when I started in 2012 was around housing and homelessness. When I got up to the legislature in 2012, it was the tail end of the recession. We were so focused on creating jobs. And then what happened is we were very fortunate. A lot of jobs were created, but what happened was there wasn't any housing created with those jobs. So it really accelerated folks becoming homeless. It accelerated our need for more housing. It's really accelerated our need for more affordable housing, frankly. That's where you see the biggest gap is really housing for folks under 80% of AMI, and also in particular, really, families and people who are living 30% of AMI. It's really very few opportunities, very few places for them to live. And so these are, I just wanted to kind of start off with those thoughts, because that's really kind of how we approach our budget and kind of what we think of, and that's what I really talk to each and all of our budget staff about doing. So let me just start off. Today is a special day, because today is the day where the governor released the May revision. So the governor proposes a budget in June. Proposes a budget in January. We start holding hearings in February all the way through May. And then the governor proposes a May revision, usually around this time. And the reason the governor proposes a May revision is because there's an April 15th tax deadline. And we get a pretty clear picture of what revenues look like based on that April 15th tax deadline. Now, this year is very odd because, as probably most of you know, that deadline got moved. And so that deadline got moved to the end, toward the end of the year in October. So we are not going to get a very clear revenue picture until November, unfortunately. So I've always thought that this year's budget should be fairly conservative, because without knowing how much we really have, we should be pretty conscientious and not overspend, because the last thing you want to do is put all these items out in the budget, spend the money, and then all of a sudden have to pull it back come January or even next June. So this year's budget is very, very tricky because of that May revision. So here's our state budget, and I tend to focus really on the general fund part of it, and this is where the revenue is. So we get about $276 billion in revenue, $230 billion in general fund revenues. And I think what's really critical is I always focus on this part, right? So this is the general fund part. You can see personal income tax is about 60%. So in California, we're very fortunate. We have a very progressive tax system. So 60% comes from personal income tax. In the large majority of that personal income tax is paid at people at the top, I'd say 1% of folks, which is also why you have a certain level of volatility, but you also have a certain level of strength. So people might wonder how during COVID, we thought the budget and the revenue was going to go down, but it actually went up. Well, during COVID, you might recall a lot of people were in very tough situations, but they weren't the people who are at the top 1%. And in particular, a lot of folks, especially in tech in particular, did very, very well. And so we actually saw that benefit with our heavy reliance on tech in the budget. So our budget went up because they were doing well. And so, this is, again, another reason to, very proud of having a very progressive revenue model. So you can see, really, we're heavily reliant on personal income tax and corporate income tax. But corporate income tax is still pretty small, it's 20%. But between the two income taxes, it's about 80% of our revenue comes from income taxes. And so we're very, very reliant. You don't see many of the other taxes make a very huge dent in our revenue model. So more importantly than where the money comes from is where do we spend it? So K through 12 education has a guarantee. It's called a Prop 98 guarantee. So because of that, based on where the revenues are, they get like the first cut of the pie, which is great. You know, if you talk to people all around the state, invariably education's generally the number one issue, or if it's, you know, 1, 2, or 3, it's very much at the top. So you see about 36% through K through 12, and really it should kind of say TK through 12 because K is not really an accurate picture. And then you got higher ed, which is 10%. So between these two, about 46, 45% is education. And so when people talk about a budget is a statement of your values, you can see education clearly for our state is number one. Number two is healthcare. And this is something, we have the same situation where it costs a lot. The costs are going out of our control, and we remain very, very committed to it. And in fact, we expanded Medi-Cal to everybody, including all undocumented immigrants here in the state of California. So we're closer and closer to having universal health care. And these, what I would tell you is these are not my charts. If you Google California Department of Finance, these are straight from their report. So I see people taking pictures. I appreciate that. They're online. If you just Google the California Department of Finance, you just click on their budget link, which is where I was this morning. They'll say which year. This is from the current year, which is the 23-24 budget. It's in their summary slides. It's within the first 7 or 8 pages. So I love these just because it just, nice pie charts, kind of makes it very accessible. The one area where I would say in general, most of us would like to see smaller is this pie, it's corrections. This is the only area of the budget that the population's plummeted, but the number's gone up. When I started in 2012, this was about $10 billion. It's now $14 billion. When I started in 2012, $10 billion was equal to what higher ed got. So higher ed in 2012 was equal to corrections, which obviously is not a correct statement of our values. But the challenge is that the only way to shrink the corrections budget is to close prisons. And we've started closing prisons. Governor Newsom's announced a few prison closures, and we actually have a lot more opportunity to close even more. But that literally is the only way to shrink that number because it's just, there's hard costs, there's people cost, all of that. So the next piece, and these I think go hand in hand, is really human services. Human services is what you think of as CalWorks, CalFresh. You think of just food and aid for really families that need it the most. And so to me, these two pieces of the pie are your kind of your social safety net. And this is where you had the most devastating cuts because it's also the area where we sort of had a little more those are the areas that got cut in sort of 2008, unfortunately. And really those would be, in my opinion, kind of like the cuts of last resort. But that gives you kind of a sense of where the budget is. If you add up education plus health and human services, it's about 80% of your budget. It's about 80% of your budget, right? And so if you think about that, it kind of makes sense because education's a top priority and making sure that we are taking care of our most vulnerable families all up and down the state. That's sort of what the California budget is because in my mind, the budget is really what the state's after, and the state's trying to provide opportunity for every family who needs it, and many families need that helping hand. So that's kind of where you see where the budget is in terms of that. And that's general fund. So it's a little bit different with. Let's see. It's a slightly little bit different when you talk about total, and the main difference is transportation, because transportation has always been a special fund. It's funded through primarily our gas tax. And I think one of the major challenges with transportation, and this is a problem with, I would say the state, is traditionally when they say transportation, they mean roads. They mean roads and highways, right? And so for us from San Francisco, that's when we think of transportation, that's not what we think of. We think of, we do think of roads, but we also think of transit. We think of active transportation. We think of pedestrian walkways. but traditionally Caltrans is highways. And so that's something that we've had to continue to fight with that agency over, and it continues to be an ongoing struggle. And, we've made a little bit of progress, I would say, since I've gotten there in the last 10 years to move more of that away. Not away, but the additional money we've made some success in active transportation and obviously public transit, but traditionally that money is all special fund money, and it goes into roads because it's paid for by the gas tax. So that's been the mindset. Oh, it is. Okay. Thanks, Susan. I don't want there to be feedback. Sorry. So the May revision, what you see is January, the governor projected a $22 billion deficit. Our LAO projection was bigger. What was the LAO projection? 30, right? So our LAO projection had about 30 instead of 22. The governor moved the projection in June to about a $30 billion deficit. I think the LAO is still $10 billion more. And in terms of the legislators, we actually think the LAO deficit's more accurate. And we're basing that on, just like we knew that we had under-projected revenues during the up times the last 2 years, what we're basing that on is based on revenue that we're bringing in. So we noticed all throughout this fiscal year, we were underperforming all the projections, that we were bringing in less revenue than what we had projected. So again, this just gives you a sense of what the governor has proposed in terms of solutions. When we say reductions, it's really reductions on money that we had planned to spend in the future, not really major reductions for this year. It's really money in the future. A trigger reduction means if we have the money, then we could spend it in the future. So that's what a trigger is. So it's based on if we have the money, then we're going to do this. Delayed spending just means, we plan to spend on year 2, now we're going to spend it in year 4. So you can see these are some of the opportunities. A fund shift means that we're borrowing money from other special funds. So we had that power when during the Great Recession, we would take money from special funds and we say, hey, we owe you special fund, we're borrowing $100 million, and then we paid it, over time we would pay them back. We have an MCO tax that we're proposing, the governor's proposed. It's a managed care organization tax. It's paid, paid by us. It's by our insurance providers. It's going to bring some money to the general fund, but also will hopefully bring some money into the healthcare system, which is really needed. So we try to explain sort of how do we get here. So when we do a budget, when we did the 2018 budget, we try to project a couple years out on what we think the revenues will be in a couple years. So you can see in 2018, we thought that the 2020 and the 2021 budget would be somewhere in this 145 area, right? By the time we got to June of 2020, we had a very different outlook, right? Because June of 2019, we weren't shut down, but June of 2020, we were. So we had a much more pessimistic view of what the budget was. But in actuality, the budget ended up not being as bad as we thought. Because, as I mentioned earlier, because of California, our reliance on income taxes, our reliance on wealthy Californians who actually did okay, because the stock market was doing well, the tech market did very, very well. So it actually ended up around 177. But you see this volatility. So going to, where's this year's budget? So you look at the June 2022 budget we thought there'd be $214 billion, right? That's what we kind of passed around there. That's what we kind of passed. And we start to little by little. So the governor said, you know what? We were off by 10 billion, and now we're off by even more, 202 billion. So that money is based on what we thought was going to be there, and then what ends up being there. Do you want to correct something, or?
Here if you need me.
Huh?
I'm here if you need me.
Okay. Is that right, or my? Okay. I'm just worried about Christian. Give me the hook. So then going into, this is the current fiscal year we're in, 202. Going into the next fiscal year, this is what we think. The revenues are going to be like 198, and we're thinking actually it's still rather optimistic because it's this 198 and going to 201, going to 204, going to 209. And this is what the Department of Finance is guessing. I actually think it might actually go down. So again, you can just see this, what we're still doing is we're still just trying to do our best guess of what revenues look like. And so what we want to make sure we're doing is not overcommitting. Because the last thing we want to do is spend money on programs and get everyone's hopes up and have all of you, especially whether it's our agencies or our community partners, to get everybody excited, and then all of a sudden say, hey, you know what? Sorry, we can't commit to it. This gives you a sense of, I think, this is a typical chart you'll see from Department of Finance in there. The part that I think is really important is the governor didn't touch the reserves. I think we may end up touching reserves by the time we finish in June, but we have $37 billion in reserves. During the 2008-2010 recession, we pretty much had no reserves. So during those devastating cuts, we saw absolutely no reserves, which I think is just, so we're in a much stronger financial situation. On top of that, we have also billions of dollars in special fund money that we can tap. So we're in a very different situation than before. You might recall during that time, the treasurer, John Chung, basically said, hey, I can't even pay bills. So we had to send out IOUs. And so that's, hopefully will not be the situation based on our, foresight and having reserves, and also making sure that we have a lot of cash to pay our bills. Oops. So where do we go from here? So we have budget hearings going through this week in terms of our subcommittees. You'll see Senate Budget Committee hearings, Assembly Budget Committee hearings. At that point, we either will have a legislative agreement where the Senate and the Assembly will come together, which we have in the last couple years, to say, hey, we have a legislative budget compared to what the governor's budget is. If not, then we'll go back to the old format where the Assembly has a budget, the Senate has a budget, and the governor's has a budget. The easiest way to really think about any kind of budget is the budget is like a 3 organizational negotiation. So once you see kind of where folks are at, it's a negotiation between our House, the Assembly, the Senate as a separate House, and then also the governor. And then we're spending that month between mid-May to mid-June, really negotiating and fine-tuning all those various items. We put up the tax deadline October 16th is because we're in uncertain times, because we really won't know how much money we have until we get to October 16th and really the fall of October, the end of October. So that's just the way to set. I wanted to get you the context to set the budget. I think we have a bunch of questions, so I was going to let Nanette start asking questions.
So before we start, I know that Assemblymember Ting wanted, with the Medi-Cal change happening, Susan Pfeiffer wanted to just say very briefly about Medi-Cal and Covered California, and ironically, I think our first question's about Medi-Cal. So,
thank you, Mark, and thank you, Assemblymember Ting. These webinar or events you do are so informative, and we really appreciate. You posted on your Facebook that Medi-Cal is going to start doing massive redeterminations of people who are currently receiving Medi-Cal starting next month. Many of you, during the public health emergency, you were able to get on Medi-Cal and get free or very, very low-cost health insurance because of that, and you are in that system now. You may start getting a letter from them telling them that your income now no longer warrants you being on Medi-Cal, and so you can go into Cover California or purchase your own health insurance. When you get those letters, don't put that off. You have 30 days to activate that. I will be available afterwards. I do enrollments for Cover California and Medi-Cal, and I can help you with that information. So if your income has gone up, they are working with the IRS and the California Tax Board, so they will see what your income is. But we're here to help you. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. So just to review how the process is going to work, Naomi, raise your hand, please, and I will be collecting question and comment cards. We are going to limit them to one per topic. I know some of you came later. So if you're sort of in agreement in what the speaker says, if you want to raise your hand, if you have a sign you want to raise it, that would be great. And Naomi and I will come around and collect those cards. And this is Nanette Miranda, our communications director, and she will be the person asking the questions today. And just a reminder for those of you that didn't come late, this is being recorded and will be posted on Facebook.
And on the website. Maybe, Susan, that you might continue, because my first question is a Medi-Cal question, and maybe both Phil and Susan can respond to this. But Phil, why don't we start with you? Can you talk more about Medi-Cal coverage and if it's worth it to apply or reapply? Yes. Yeah. Well, if you are eligible.
It's absolutely worth it to apply and to reapply. I think one of the challenges that with Medi-Cal coverage, and I feel very bad about this, we've been working very hard. We're working hard to take away that asset test. It's basically if you have any assets to even like a car or a nice car, you have to get rid of it to get on Medi-Cal. So we've been really trying to raise that asset limit much higher. We don't think we should be driven into poverty just to get health care. So that's something that we've been fighting for. But absolutely, if your Medi-Cal is lapsing and you need to reapply, please do reapply.
Yes, if you are eligible for regular Medi-Cal, that means your insurance is likely going to be free or low cost. And for any of you who've been on Kaiser within the last year with no problems, Kaiser is the only insurance carrier that will cover people on Medi-Cal. And for many, it's free. It's nothing to be embarrassed about. Use it.
And thank you, Anthony, for that question. All righty. So this one's a comment by Pat. I strongly support adequate funding for transit. We need it for, 1, to help the environment and get cars off the road, 2, save money so that poor people and those without cars can get around, and 3, provide access for seniors and others who don't drive. So I'm going to follow that up with a question from Alex. With the understanding that it's a tough budget year, how can transit agencies and advocates support efforts to serve short-term operations and funding assistance without major general fund impacts? Any funding, as you see, sources see as most viable?
Yeah. Thanks for that. Thanks for both the statement and the question. I know there's a lot of transit advocates here. Really appreciate that. As I started off with my opening comments, we, the Assembly, really led the effort last year as part of this the high-speed rail discussion was held over a year because we really couldn't agree with the governor on just giving a complete blank check on high-speed rail without more money for transit. We saw that transit was suffering not just in the Bay Area, but really all over the state. And so we fought to get that $4 billion appropriation into the budget last year. Was really very excited to see it there. We were very unhappy to see part of it being cut, and that's something that we'll be fighting for going into our May-June negotiation. Having said that, I know very much that there's a fiscal cliff coming here in the Bay Area. Personally, I feel the transit agencies should have been better prepared to really be ready for this and really needed to have sounded the alarm earlier. Having said that, we are where we are, so we can't change the past. There's just my statement on it. I have the honor of chairing our Bay Area caucus, and the Bay Area caucus are all the Bay Area legislators. In the last 2 meetings, we meet monthly, the last 2 meetings were specifically on transit and to really talk about this fiscal cliff and what to do. And so I think without, we don't really talk about what happens in our meetings, but just to give you a sense of the sentiment. So the caucus, myself, we're absolutely committed to make sure that we're doing everything possible to make sure that our agencies do not go over a fiscal cliff. We've invested billions of dollars in transit throughout our history. It would be, we don't want to have any stranded assets. We know that once these agencies would have to stop service, it's very difficult to turn it back on. So I think the question is how best to do that. As you can see, I put this chart back on because in general you're going to see fairly flat revenues and probably revenues are going to go down. This is our general fund, right? And so I think what we are going to need is we are absolutely going to need to figure out a way how to sustain the agencies. Now, my personal view is there's discussions on a ballot measure, and the Metropolitan Transportation Commission has been talking about going to the ballot in 2024 for housing, and they've been talking to go the ballot in 2026 for transit. And I personally feel that based on what the fiscal situation is, those should really be flip-flopped, in that the urgency is we should be going with transit in 2024. Part of the reason is we are not going to have that much money to really help the agencies, especially from a general fund or even from a special fund point of view. So I think the goal is if we can help get the agencies to where they need to be to get to a ballot measure, I think that's really the ultimate goal. I think the other piece of it is, and this is not just for the transit agencies, this is for everybody, that when you come to budget committee, is to actually come with a very specific ask. So when we had the head of the California transportation agencies, and he came to budget in, I think it was in March, he couldn't even articulate how much money that was needed for the transit agencies. Had no number. And so how can you help an agency or agencies that can't even tell you what the problem is? And so for us, that's something absolutely critical. So if you ever do advocacy, right, you want to come with how much do we really need, and then also what that's for, right? So I know for the Bay Area, we have a breakout by each of our 20-something agencies of what specifically is needed, what they project going on. I think the second piece of it is to make sure that there is strong accountability. Christian will remind me that if this were a school district and we had to go bail out a school district, that in essence, we would do two things. We have an agency, we have a fiscal agency that we send in there to do a fiscal assessment immediately to understand really what the fiscal situation is. They basically do an audit. The other part of it is we would put the school district in receivership. We would take it over, because if they are in such dire need and they're going to go bankrupt, that we would actually take it over. And so I think we need to make sure that there's accountability. If we are able to do our part and really help these agencies, we absolutely need to make sure that there's accountability so that the money's spent right, that there actually is a focus on ridership, on increases in ridership, on making sure that the riders come in first. Not just, oftentimes you'll hear, which is good. I'm not saying we shouldn't hear about this. Oftentimes you hear about the lines, you hear about the on-time performance. Oftentimes you don't hear about, okay, what's the rider experience, and also how are the riders feeling, and is this going to bring back riders? So I know that we have to do everything possible also to bring back riders. So that's what's really missing in this plan. There is hey, state, help us. There's not this is how we're going to help ourselves, and this is how we're going to bring people back into our systems. And I think that's what's kind of missing. And I think whenever you look at that, usually you wouldn't think that's a very strong case. I think this situation is so dire that we absolutely can't. And I have the honor of representing San Francisco. The Senate budget chair happens to represent Alameda. So the three biggest agencies impacted are BART, Muni, and AC Transit, right? And so we are very, very focused on, we're having discussions with our budget staff on exactly what can be done. I know for advocates, you have ideas about accountability. Whatever ideas you have about accountability, we're all ears, especially for those of you who represent riders. I think we very much want a rider-focused accountability system to hold people's feet to the fire. But I think there has been unfortunately, lack of preparedness. And I really do think if it is urgent, which I think it is urgent, then we need to treat it with urgency, and we need to try to figure out how to get to the ballot in 24 to help ourselves. Because what I hear from my Southern California colleagues is, well, LA, we went to the ballot years ago. We had our own transportation measure. You know, we're not relying on fare box. So, you know, you Bay Area, you rely on fare box. That's why you're in this situation. If you actually were generating more revenue on your own, then you'd be better off. The other thing is, recently found out, I think there's a misunderstanding in terms of that the region needs authority. Actually, a previous legislature, about 15 years ago, actually gave our 9 Bay Area counties authority, and we're going back and double checking this, authority to raise the gas tax for specifically transportation. And that authority currently is there in the code. I'm going to go back and double check because I just heard about this. But that also means that there may not have to be legislative action in front of going to the ballot in 24. So I know that's a long-winded answer, but I know there's a lot of folks here, and hopefully that sort of covered, I think, what people are thinking about.
All right, next question is from Charles. How can we ensure ongoing funding for homeless services and supportive housing here in San Francisco and California more broadly?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And if I showed you this chart, you're like, where's housing and homelessness, right? Yeah, it's in the other. Yes, it's in the other. Because, like I mentioned before, when I got up to the legislature, housing was not top of mind. Housing was not something the state felt like they could kind of fix. Most of the money for housing, like housing, transportation, came from the feds. So, you know, most of that was really, that's what the state's mindset is. And I think the situation on housing has become so dire that we feel that we have to do a couple things. And you've been seeing it. We have been passing legislation on a variety of things to streamline it, make it easier to build housing. One of my niches in the housing area has really been around ADUs, and otherwise known as in-laws in San Francisco, but to really streamline the construction of ADUs and to make it easier to build ADUs. We've seen a huge amount of interest all around the state. It's very exciting. It's one of the success stories around housing supply. So that's one piece, making sure that we're passing legislation, make it easier to build the housing. 2, I mentioned the biggest challenge is funding affordable housing, because the only way you can build affordable housing is it has to be subsidized. That's just by definition. Is for folks who can't afford market rate housing, they need a subsidy. So we have increased the amount of money to subsidize affordable housing and housing for the homeless. And housing for the homeless, I think of it as supportive housing and also shelter, temporary shelter. We've also tried to be more focused and trying to get a better sense of really how we're doing. I have a bill right now that really is going to be inserted into our budget discussion. We set up a $1 billion fund to give money to counties, cities, continuums of care that is completely no strings attached money to fight homelessness. But we also need more performance measures. We haven't really seen how the money's been spent, what the product is. I think the only things that people really care about are 2 measurements. And there's a lot of little measures along the way. But in general, there's 2 measurements people care about, which is 1, how many people are getting off the street? And then 2, how many people are getting into permanent housing? That's the bottom line, right? Because it's not, even if they're in shelter, that's not stabilization. It's permanent supportive housing. So that's what we're really trying to focus on. You'll see that this year's budget, we continue to fund many of our homelessness proposals. The governor's big proposal around Project Home Key. You know, we have our discretionary money to our cities and counties. We're going to continue to remain very, very, very committed to that, but it's still, frankly, not enough. If we don't build more housing, we absolutely will not be able to tackle this issue. And I think that there's been oftentimes sort of too much discussion of what comes first, affordable housing or market rate housing. And I would say both come first. They have to both be built now. or they should have both been built yesterday. And so I think, in essence, we shouldn't really be having that debate. We should be debating, how do we build both faster? And how do we get more communities to build both in all their communities, right? And I think that's what you're going to start seeing. We've seen the cities move a little bit on this issue, but nowhere near enough to get to our 2 million unit shortfall. What you're going to need to see is we're going to be pushing cities a lot harder, or giving a lot more freedom to all developers to be able to build housing, build affordable housing, and also build housing for the homeless. Because what you'll see, you saw this in LA. LA passed a huge revenue measure to fight homelessness, and then the mayor tried to get every city council member to build housing to house the homeless, and couldn't do it. They would not accept in every single council district at least one project to help fight homelessness, right? So that's sort of what we're up against. People are fine approving the money, but when it comes to where to put the site, what the site looks like, how it gets built, how large it is, that's where we run into a lot of opposition.
Thanks. So this is just to follow up on housing, just a comment from Mitch. Please support the Community Anti-Displacement and Preservation Program funding of $500 million. Even as we build new affordable housing, we are losing existing homes. Affordable preservation is a cost-effective way to prevent displacement and keep housing permanently affordable.
Yeah, Mitch, thanks. Great point, and it's something that we've been more focused on prevention. I think the hardest part about prevention is having the hard numbers to say, okay, how many people did you help stay in their home? Because so many of these folks are literally on the edge. So they're just, they're one missed paycheck, one missed something away, or one, car crash away from being on the edge. And so really appreciate that. That's something that we've been more cognizant of. We're trying to do more in the area. It's very hard just because you saw the financial situation, but I know that during COVID, when we did have the money, we tried to get as much money out in terms of really preservation, making sure that people were able to stay in their homes. So really appreciate bringing that point up.
Okay, next question is from Kevin. Why don't you cut the gas tax? It's hurting everybody.
Okay. Well done. See, I love the audience here. Like, if this was Bakersfield, that would have been a different reaction. Well, we don't cut the gas tax because then this money would be lower. It would it'd be more potholes, it'd be more crack roads. You might have noticed, and I know a lot of folks, especially the folks in transportation, know this. You might have noticed all over the highways and streets all around the state, roads getting repaired. I mean, I know that for me, I get to be the lucky legislator on the west side that talks about paving 19th Avenue, paving Park Presidio, because every legislator for like decades has promised that street needed to get paved. And that street only got paved because we raised the gas tax. I mean, you started seeing a lot more money for active transportation, whether it is the bike lanes, whether you see protected bike lanes. That is because we raised the gas tax. So money going towards transit, money going towards more of that is because we raised the gas tax. So that really, that gas tax really pays to ensure that our transportation is functioning. In general, we thought it was the fairest way to do it. One thing we are looking at, especially as more and more of us start driving electric vehicles or clean vehicles, is moving away from a gas tax and moving maybe more towards vehicle miles driven that's being piloted. We're not switching over that tomorrow, but in the long run, you may see more of that movement move toward how many miles are you driving versus how much gas you're buying. Tricky part, and it cuts both ways, is a lot of the poorest people drive the most. So the ones who can't afford to live in the Bay Area but work in the Bay Area, but they live in Modesto, they live in Tracy, they live in Stockton, they're paying the most, and they are unfortunately driving the most. And so I think that's something that we're obviously very, very sensitive to, which is also why, I say that tongue in cheek, but also why, that question gets sometimes a different reaction when you're in Modesto or in Merced or in Bakersfield than here in San Francisco.
All right, next question. Nobody left a name. But do you foresee cuts or increases to TK to 12 education?
I think we remain really committed. So we did a great thing a couple years ago. We expanded. So TK was a program created when we moved the date to enroll in kindergarten. It used to be the date was early December. Now I think it's September. So we moved it 3 months. And so we said every kid in that 3-month window, you didn't get kindergarten early, but we're going to give you TK. So 25% of the kids who were born in that September-December window got TK, and every other kid, 75% of the other kids, got nothing. And that really is not very fair. I mean, if you think about the definition of public education, to have only 25% get something just based on their birth date, and others not, it's just not fair. So we've now expanded TK, or are in the process of expanding TK, to everybody. And so every 4-year-old will eventually have TK for all, which we think is the right way to go, the right policy. For all of you who are interested or have questions, especially if you have newborns, feel free to ask us any kind of questions you want. But I think we fully anticipate being able to commit and continue to deliver on TK over the next few years.
All right, the next question.
Christian,
so sorry.
So I just wanted to also, not sure if that question was also about K12 funding writ large, and I just want to comment that because when revenues go down, our funding for education is based on something called Prop 98, so that does reduce how much goes for education, which is obviously something we're all concerned about. But what the May revision proposes, which I think will be pretty consistent with the final budget, is there's a small reduction in Prop 98, but all of the education reductions are away from things that impact the classroom. And I believe that the May revision actually has a higher level of funding for classroom funding than the January budget. So there is some stuff going on with the budget where the less money means we have to make some decisions, but in terms of like the classroom money that teachers are counting on, the school district counting on, we're trying to leave that protected because we know school districts have been impacted so greatly the last couple of years by all the uncertainties. We want to make sure that that isn't a problem going forward.
All right. Next question comes from Reverend Gregory. Can you speak to the critical funding for climate justice projects that were cut before the May revision? How are climate justice projects being funded?
Yeah. We were, just so ecstatic last year to be able to fund over, I think it was $64 billion, about? $54 billion in terms of climate projects. I mean, just phenomenal projects around, clean cars, urban forestry, around, wildfires, around soils, every kind of major kind of project that you could have. The governor in the January proposal cut some of that funding. Those are programs that we're going to keep fighting for. His proposal, which we are taking a look at, is looking at can we not spend some of that money, but can we float a bond to cover some of that shortfall? So I think we definitely are very, very committed to those programs. We're just trying to figure out whether we fund it through the general fund or maybe we go to the voters with a bond to fund those other projects. But they remain, very much important part of the budget.
This is just a comment. That's on transit again. I am a member of Senior Disability Action. This is Joyce, by the way. Pope Francis calls us to hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, of seniors and people with disabilities. We need the funding to fill the gap for transit operations. Otherwise, seniors will die from isolation, loneliness, mental illness, and death by suicide. Next question. Again, a follow-up to Medi-Cal, because it's the program that helps fund healthcare for people who are eligible. Will we still expand Medi-Cal for undocumented people? I'm assuming given that the budget situation.
So That has not been cut. Medi-Cal continues to be funded for everybody, whether you are documented or undocumented. So I don't think you have to think about it as undocumented. Just, the people who are eligible for Medi-Cal, regardless of documentation, remain eligible for Medi-Cal.
All right, question from Derek. How can we keep the California film tax credit incentives intact to ensure our local film and TV community jobs and wages are still around? We favor keeping jobs and productions in California. Diversity has grown, and we need to continue it.
I think the governor has proposed a film tax credit. It's the fourth version of that tax credit since it started a few years ago. I think we're in our 7th or 8th year of that tax credit. We're in what's called the third version of it. Right now, we are in the process of discussing the mechanics of it. So there's two major pieces of that proposal, which is there's the tax credit itself. There's actually three pieces. There's a tax credit itself. There is who gets to use it. So there's now a new provision in there that's called refundability. And the refundability would be, instead of making it a tax credit, almost becomes like an entitlement. So if you do the production, you get a check instead of saying it's a tax credit. The third piece of it, which is the piece that I think our house, the Assembly, is really most concerned about, it is really diversity. I don't advertise this since I live in San Francisco, represent San Francisco, but I grew up in LA. And growing up in LA, there's one industry in LA, which is the movie industry, the film industry. And so what we want to make sure is that, historically, certain communities have not been able to participate in that industry. And we want to make sure that there are really much more strengthening around diversity goals, really around what's achieved through diversity. If you look at what the tax was on 3.0, tax 3.0, what we saw is there were some, there were some diversity goals, but it was one of those like, hey, why don't you try? And hopefully if you try, then maybe it will become more diverse. And what we saw based on the numbers is not that many people tried, which I think for those of us who work in this world, it's not a surprise. Diversity is very tough. It's a very tough topic. It's a very sensitive topic. But when you ask people to just kind of give it their best shot, usually they don't really achieve it. And so I think we're in the process of really trying to figure out what would push everybody in the industry to really make the workforce more diverse and also make those participating in the tax credit more diverse. And so that's really the crux of where that discussion is going. But again, we are, as a state, and I remain that, we are very, very committed to making sure that Hollywood remains, that the industry remains in California. I will say, you've heard about all the different other things that we compete with. Again, these are all the things that we compete with. I am concerned about a long term, and this will come long after I'm gone, but I am concerned about a race to the bottom because people say, oh, Georgia's got these tax cuts, New York's got these tax cuts, and I know that there's this constant jockeying and fighting for our film industry. Having said that, I know it's important that we keep Hollywood here. We want to keep our jobs here. I think we remain very, very committed to that. But we don't want to get in a race to the bottom. We don't want this to be like a sports team where we get threatened by a sports team and say, hey, if you don't give us money, then we're going to leave, right? I mean, it really needs to be much more symbiotic. So if we can have a situation where you see a broader cross-section of people being able to benefit, really all communities are benefiting, especially in Southern California, I think you're going to see more support and the ability to kind of get that tax credit done. But that's really the crux of the matter.
All right, staying on the Medi-Cal topic and healthcare, what is the state doing to protect small independent hospitals and increase Medi-Cal reimbursement rates? Costs keep going up, and Medi-Cal and Medicare only cover 75% of the cost to the hospitals.
Great question. So I represent Daly City. my hospital in Daly City, Seton Hospital, has gone through 3 different owners. I know we have folks in the room who've worked with folks who work in that hospital. It's very, very stressful. Our hospitals have really gone through quite a lot over the last couple of years, especially with COVID. We have a number of hospitals that are on the edge because they serve our most vulnerable clients. They serve those who can't pay. So they're the ones that have Medi-Cal. They're those ones that have Medicare. So the reason I went back to this slide is we are talking about raising the MCO tax, the managed care organization tax. Some of that money will go to the general fund. We're in discussions about where the other money will go in terms of to healthcare. There's discussions about reimbursement rates, which is a way of saying we would give the Medi-Cal, the Medi-Cal system more money so that the reimbursement rates would go higher. Part of the challenges is for folks that serve people who are paying Medi-Cal, Medicare, if the rate that they're getting, that the insurance is reimbursing the physicians and the hospitals is not high enough, they can't stay in business. So that's a major point. We're going to be discussing what we can do in terms of where that money will go in terms of providers, hospitals. We also just set up an emergency loan fund. We just passed $150 million for distressed hospitals to really help keep them from the edge. It is a loan. I mentioned this when I was talking about transit. One of the first requirements to get the loan is you have to demonstrate that you have a viability plan, so that after you get the money, how will this money how will you keep your operations going with this money? And so again, that needs to be developed. That just got passed. We're waiting for the governor to sign it. We hope that that'll help a number of distressed hospitals on the edge, but something that's obviously very concerning. We are lucky here. We have a lot of options in San Francisco. You go across the bridge, you go into the Central Valley, you got one hospital every 100 miles or 200 miles, a very, very different situation. One of the hospitals that just closed was in Madera. There's no other hospital around, I think, for like 50 miles or 100 miles. So it's a very, very different situation. So something that we're very concerned about, and we're definitely watching very closely.
All right, next question. What does our budget do to support immigrants and refugees?
Wow. Okay. I think it's a great question. And it's, immigrants and refugees are everywhere, right? And so first and foremost, if immigrants and refugees are in school, whether it's, and this is really early education to higher education, if they're in school, that's where they're going to get the most support from the state. If immigrant and refugees need, health care, that's a huge chunk in terms of our public health dollars going there. And then again, we have human services. For the lowest income immigrants and refugees, we have our programs around CalFresh, CalWorks, a variety of programs. Now, we've been able to make progress to expand programs for immigrants and refugees who haven't traditionally qualified. So just to give you an example, we're huge fans of the California Earned Income Tax Credit. So just a reminder, if you have friends or family or even your clients, please remind them to fill out their taxes, whether or not they owe taxes. If they are working and they earn less than a certain amount of money, we are able to give them up to thousands of dollars back in support. And so we really encourage everyone to fill out their taxes. Now, the last couple years, we've expanded the Earned Income Tax Credit to families who don't have a Social Security number. They just have a individual tax identification number. So for those families, that's something that we've been able to do for immigrants and refugees who aren't documented. So we really encourage you to do that. So for a lot of folks, they don't even know that. And if they're not filling out their taxes, they're literally giving up hundreds to thousands of dollars. And so
And I just want to tag on to that in the May revision that just got released today, there's additional money. As many people know, Title 42 expired yesterday, so there's a issue with refugees and people at the border that's going to be present right now. The state has had a pretty sizable investment in that area for the last couple of years to try to deal with that, and that's probably why you haven't heard the stories from California that you hear about Texas and Florida and New York with all the busing and all this stuff. You're not hearing that here because the state has a pretty good program at social services, and the governor's proposing to expand it given sort of what's going on right now with the Title 42 situation down at the border.
All right, so this is a little bit long, so bear with me. From Megan. We appreciate the Assembly members' leadership in the establishment of the Domestic Worker and Employer Education and Outreach Program. With the ongoing lack of health and safety protections for domestic workers and the pilot coming to an end next year, will the Assembly support the budget request to implement the recommendations of SB 21's Advisory Committee to ensure compliance with Cal OSHA and expand the program? If you recall, SB 321 is unemployment for undocumented.
Yes, absolutely. So I single-handedly can't promise it'll be in the budget, but it's something that, as you know, that I have fought with all of you in the past. I'm going to keep fighting with you. We will stand together to kind of fight for this. So you absolutely know that I will continue to support more funding for our domestic workers, more funding to make sure that we keep really all of you who work every day by yourselves in households, really in very vulnerable situations. And so I'm very sensitive to that. Really appreciate all the folks for coming out today and talking about it and highlighting it. But yeah, you've had my support in the past, and you will keep my support in the future. So we will absolutely keep fighting for this, no question.
All right. From Christine with Sister Warriors. What is the state doing to support in-person / jail rehabilitation, housing, and getting better wages for formerly incarcerated people?
It's a great question. So I'll give you the frank answer. We're not doing enough. It's the one area that I'm really excited about having taken the first step, which is closing prisons. And what I hope is, I hope this number comes down, or what I do is I hope part of this number goes towards housing, services, employment training, because people talk about, well, how do you keep communities safe? Well, you keep communities safe by giving people more opportunities, and then you make it so that they're better off working than going to commit crime. Too often we see folks who just feel like they have no choice, and they're stuck in this circumstance, and they're stuck in terms of having to live. And so one area where we're trying to do much better, and I wish I could tell you these are all the great things we've done, is one, we've been working to try to get more rehabilitation services in our jails. That took a hit during COVID, because you had folks that couldn't go into the jails or into the prisons. You had folks that couldn't get classes, couldn't get programming. And so that is starting to come back. Two, we have some great providers who provide housing, provide services for folks on their way out. We don't have anywhere near enough of them to scale. So that's one of our challenges is, you got we have a fabulous provider, Delancey Street. They are phenomenal in terms of what kind of services they provide, but they've been about the same size because they're like, hey, in order for us to be effective, this is who we can serve, this is how many people we can serve, and we do a phenomenal job serving those folks. So part of our challenges is we need a lot more Delancey Streets up and down the state, not just in San Francisco. We're so lucky to have them here, but up and down the state. So we have been working on trying to figure out how do we grow and how do we sustain that. It's been a point that we have not been fully successful. For the person who asked that question, if you have ideas on where we should, who else we should be working with, or what else we should be doing, we are all ears, because that's something that I would love to be able to take some of that $18 billion, because we are going to be saving money. Down the road, we are going to be saving more and more money as these facilities close, as some of the yards are closing, and I'd love to be able to put them back into service providers to really help people on their way out really get to a better life.
Yeah, that was Sister Warriors, so I think you got an invitation there. Jessica asks, why is there a tax credit for childcare but not elder care?
Not what, sorry?
Why is there a tax credit for childcare but not elder care?
Oh, great question. I don't know. Part of the way we do elder care is we have a pretty phenomenal program called In-Home Support Services. Some of you might have heard of it. I was very lucky when my grandmother was living with my parents. We used an in-home support services provider. It was absolutely, it's a beautiful situation. Here I have my Chinese grandmother who speaks, Mandarin, doesn't speak much English. We had a fabulous in-home support services provider who spoke very little English, spoke Spanish, and it was just the most beautiful relationship to watch. And just because of just her love and just her love and her caretaking of my grandmother, it was a perfect situation for us, despite the communication barrier. And so we have really seen that as one of our major options in terms of providing in-home support services. What we do instead of a tax credit is if you qualify for in-home support services, and you're a family member, you could get county funding, right? And so there's some ways around that. I also have a bill that I'm carrying to start to pilot so that if you are a family member and you want to get access to in-home support services, that if you are undocumented, you could do that as well. Because right now, we're trying to get more and more people to do in-home support services. Do you want to add to that, or you have? Okay.
All right, next question is, thank you for expanding UC enrollment, University of California enrollment for California students. Can we anticipate this to continue?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. It's something that I'm extraordinarily proud about. I partnered with our Assembly member from Sacramento, Kevin McCarty, who chairs our budget subcommittee in education. And I think really the two of us absolutely demanded that UC had to start reversing its out-of-state enrollment increase and really start increasing its in-state enrollment. What we have done is really start to increase our funding to higher education. It's definitely gone up significantly. And at the same time, we're working with the new president who really is much more focused on increasing in-state enrollment. And part of that is not just on paying for those slots, it's making sure there's housing. I mentioned, you can't create jobs and not create housing. You can't admit students and not build housing either. So on top of us giving them additional funding for in-state students, we've also set up money, about $4 billion, half of it grants, half of it loans, and we're fighting. Some of that was cut, so we're fighting those cuts as well. But to allow community colleges, UCs, CSUs to build housing, really excited that one of those projects that got approved was at San Francisco State. They're breaking ground on the housing project out there. And why that's so important is the universities can actually build housing faster. They can take advantage of their state status to build housing faster. In addition, if you have housing, like if you just have housing for San Francisco State and you have like 200 students or 400 students housed there, it means 400 students who aren't looking for housing in that surrounding community, which means 400 more units available for everybody else. So it's a very, very symbiotic circle.
All right, next question is from Melody. Currently, there is very little training on identifying and interacting with people with Alzheimer's for law enforcement. What is your position on the Alzheimer's Association's bill to require dementia training for California's law enforcement to prevent traumatic experiences for those living with Alzheimer's and responding officers?
Yeah. Really appreciate the question. I haven't had a chance to review the bill. Sounds like something I would support, but it's hard for me to promise to vote for it without actually having to look at it. But I appreciate you mentioning it, and I'll make sure that we work with my staff to take a hard look at the bill.
I read that the California budget expanded child care subsidies for eligible families. I qualify, but I cannot use it. There are no providers. What is being done?
I'm going to turn it over to Christian because Christian's our child care expert. So.
However, you just proposed something, right? The child care COLA.
So, Nanette, I think is right on there. We right now have a pretty robust system in California in offering childcare subsidies, but our subsidy rate that we offer when we pay providers is based on data from 2016, so the Obama administration. So that was a long time ago. We want to adjust that. The Assembly put out a proposal on Monday to essentially increase the rates we pay by 25%, which essentially sounds like a lot of money, but actually just adjust the rate we pay for inflation because people are not taking our vouchers anymore because they don't cover what it really costs for the care. And frankly, in 2016, they didn't either. So we're working on that. It's a big priority because we've had a really difficult time getting the governor in particular to want to do this. He doesn't like to raise rates anywhere. So that's something that was put out, and it was a very visible thing, and I think that'll help a lot. But honestly, there's a lot of work to do. The child care system in the state is changing. It's very expensive to provide child care, to pay people what they deserve to do that really important work. And at the same time, so you want to have people working there to have a living wage, providing the care, so it's a real career. But then at the same time, for parents to be able to afford that kind of care is very expensive. So the state really needs to step in to bridge that gap so that families have access to quality, affordable child care. People want to be in the early childhood education field. They can make a career out of it, and they can have a good life. And we as a state have a role in sort of shaping that future.
All right, this is from Dan. Sorry, there's a lot of smudges on this card, so I'm not sure I can read it correctly. The administration keeps maneuvering for the legislature to give them blank check authority. California Energy Commission contradicting trigger cuts, Joshua Tree, etc., even the trailer bills. Is the legislature likely to push back or give in?
Oh, we're definitely pushing back. If you watch our budget hearing, so we on the Joshua Tree trailer bill, we are rejecting it. My colleague from Orinda, Assemblymember Bauer Cahan, has a bill to really deal with that issue. It may end up back in budget, but we're very much pushing back. You might have heard me in budget the other day also on the energy trailer bill, where the administration's asking to have fairly blank check authority to buy energy, and they're not even willing to commit that it's going to be clean energy. We saw that when we gave them authority to buy emergency energy for the strategic reserve, and they went out and bought natural gas energy rather than buying clean energy. So that's something that we are going to be, debating and discussing over the next couple weeks. But the way we look at it is, if you want to be able to buy energy, it better be clean energy, and it better be energy that, frankly, our energy providers are not purchasing. Because if we as a state are just competing with all the other energy providers, whether it's public power, or whether it's the independent operators like PG&E, then all you're doing is just raising the price for that same energy. So we want to make sure that we are focused on, if you want to help buy energy in the future, or you want to help an industry grow, then that's a whole nother thing. But I think absolutely we're pushing back pretty hard on all those requests.
All right, this one's from Maria. The California Green Business Network has been receiving state funding for the last 5 years to assist small businesses to operate more sustainably. We're worried that when we're out of our current contract at the end of this calendar year, we won't have funding for small businesses. While we expect a gap due to the deficit, we're trying to have a line item budget for the next fiscal year. So I guess the question is, what's that likelihood?
Really appreciate it. I know we had a chance to talk outside, so really appreciate you bringing it up. I'll be working with my staff to take a look and see, what things look like for this coming budget year, and what the likelihood of being able to keep that funding going. So appreciate you for bringing it up.
All right, from Jenny. How are you ensuring that the state investments in the most vulnerable Californians facing climate change, economic recession, and attacks against immigrants and low-income workers? How are you ensuring that the most vulnerable? I guess the question is, how are you ensuring that the state continues investing in issues like climate change, the most vulnerable of our population?
I think it's a great question. And so what I said earlier is that's why we built the reserves, and that's why we stay focused on what our priorities are. And that's why I said, if you look at the general fund, because the total expenditures are a little bit of a misnomer because it's also federal pass-throughs as well as money that we're borrowing. If you look at the general fund again, it's education, it's health, human services. That's the largest chunk by far. And so that focus is really on our most vulnerable communities. I think what we need to do better is the last couple of years, because we have had so much more money in our state budget, not all of that money's gone out the door, right? We just talked about childcare. There's that article in the Chronicle about providers not being able to get access to the money that we already appropriated. We've seen that over and over again in other examples. And so we see many vulnerable communities talking about, hey, we need help. My feeling is, boy, we put that money in the budget. Unfortunately, some of it's still working through our bureaucracy. So when I was talking at a luncheon by the California, it's a California Budget and Policy Center. I always want to call it the California Budget Project. But the California Budget and Policy Center and their coalition of advocates, many like yourselves, who really focus on the most vulnerable. I said, one thing you have to focus on next is not just getting the money into the budget, it's making sure the money gets spent correctly and making sure the money actually gets to the community. And so that's one thing that we're starting to focus on, and making sure that the money is getting out the door, the money is getting out the community. That's the next phase, because frankly, because there's less new money coming in, that money that's already been appropriated is so critical. So we want to make sure that it's being spent appropriately. So that's where I would really spend time and focus.
I would love to switch to an electric vehicle, but I think they're so expensive. What are you doing to help low-income workers like me afford one?
Great question. A couple things. When you start with any kind of subsidy, what you're trying to do is to increase interest, increase demand, because the price is always high, and the folks that have the means are buying that item. But the more that they buy, more people start producing. And we've actually, two things. We've increased demand for electric cars, but we've also forced automakers to build more electric cars, because we've already told them, you're going to have to build electric cars. The other piece of it is, for many, many working families, they don't buy new cars, they buy used cars. And so what we also are doing is making sure that we're starting to put money into our used car programs and to make sure that they have access to those too. Because 5 years ago, there were barely any new electric vehicles, much less used electric vehicles. Now you're starting to see prices come down because there are more new cars, but there are also more used cars. And so my hope is that as we keep going and more and more new cars are coming out, you're going to see more new cars coming out, prices going down, and you're also going to see prices be more competitive for used cars as well. So this will take time, and we've seen a lot of change over the last 3-4 years. I think the next 5 years, you're going to also see a huge amount of change. In addition, I'm carrying a bill that's asking the California Air Resources Board to really take a look at what I call super users. I described a super user earlier, the people who are paying the most for gas because they're living in Modesto and driving to the Bay Area. So for those folks who are under a certain income but doing the biggest drive, what I think is we should actually increase their incentive, because if I could give that person who's driving, say, 20 to 30,000 miles a year in their car out of a gas car into electric vehicle, we are saving a ton of greenhouse gases. And so I think that person needs a higher incentive, really needs a larger amount of money so that we can get them out. It's great if we have people in electric vehicles in San Francisco, but if they're only driving 10 miles a day and they're taking transit, which is what they should be doing, they really shouldn't be getting the same amount of incentive as the person who's forced to live far away and drive in because they really have no other economic choice.
All right, to give the Assembly member time for closing remarks, we're going to do only 2 more questions, but we promise if we didn't get to your question, the Assembly member will be able to read all your cards. So, second to the last question from Susan. Please talk about a bill to get federal waiver for single-payer health care in California.
Every year we have a bill really moving towards single payer. I've always been a huge single payer advocate. I think we need to move towards single payer. I think we'd have a much cheaper system if we had single payer. It's something I remain very, very committed to. I actually don't know all the ins and outs of this particular bill, but in general, what it does, what most of the bills have done is you set up a system to start moving the state toward single payer. One of the first things you have to do is request permission to move this direction from the federal government, and also to do a public option. And then eventually, hopefully, we take that first step of public option, and eventually, hopefully, we can, as all of us have that choice to be able to buy Medicare, those of us who don't qualify can buy into it, then hopefully we can move closer and closer towards a single payer system. One thing, and I forget if you know the exact number, Christian, but people are so scared, and I realize it because people feel economically vulnerable, but they're so scared about losing their health insurance. I think it's like, what is it? It's like 2/3 or like over 60% of Californians are already on publicly subsidized or government health care, some number. A third. 1/3? It's only 1/3? I think it's higher.
Oh, it's 1/3 of adults and 2/3 of children.
Oh, that's what it is. Okay. So one third of adults are already on government health care. 2/3 of children are on government health care. So again, we've already moved in that direction. It's not like nobody's on government health care. We've already moved heavily in that direction. So it's not something that is so scary or the government can't do. So again, something that we have to think, I think, much more serious about. This, like I said, this is a huge part of our budget. Just remember, we spend more on health care than any other country per capita, per person, and we have the worst public health outcomes. It's horrible. So we're spending more and getting less. So somebody else is making money, and we're getting a bad product. It's like paying Ritz-Carlton prices and staying at the Holiday Inn. I mean, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. So that's a bad deal for us as a country, as a state. So something that we have to definitely look at.
And last question. I see that the state budget has finally been investing in Asian American communities. With hate incidents still going on, do we anticipate even more investment?
Great question. Unfortunately, we saw a huge spike in anti-AAPI hate during COVID. It didn't help when you have somebody in the White House who every day was just fanning hate against everybody. And was just the bully in chief, frankly, in the country. We were very proud that California, by far, did the largest investment in really stepping up and trying to fight anti-AAPI hate. We had a $166 million AAPI equity budget. Just to give you a contrast, New York funded $20 million. And so our investment was so much bigger, so much more comprehensive. I know as a member of our API Legislative Caucus, we're fighting for more funding. So that's something that was the only thing we asked of the governor to put in the budget. Now, the governor, and I really want to commend the governor, put in $10 million in the May revise, so we really appreciate that. That's a great first step. We're going to ask for more. Just like all of you are asking me for more for stuff, we're going to ask for more of him for that. And hopefully we're going to be able to do better. So is that the last question, Nanette? Okay. So let me just thank all of you for really coming out and sharing a wide variety of all your questions, all your thoughts. Really appreciate this. This town hall is really for all of you, in hopes that you learn something about the budget, but also that you can also be better advocates, frankly. I want all of you to be more successful, because every single one of you is fighting for something that's really important. Whether you're fighting for transit, whether you're fighting for domestic workers, whether you're fighting for childcare, whether you're fighting for housing, Medi-Cal, everything that's been asked for, homelessness. It is so important. I really appreciate everything you do. And so part of the reason why I do these town halls is also to help you, sort of fine tune your budget advocacy. What I always say is, as a reminder, start early. I work on budget all year round, so the second that I'm done with this year's budget, I get ready for next year's budget. It's something that the budget staff is really much more available in the fall than they are in the spring. So as you have items that maybe didn't quite make the finish line this year, a great time to schedule meetings with all of them on both the Assembly and the Senate and the Department of Finance is really in the fall, which is a much slower time for us. I always say don't be disappointed if any item doesn't make it this year. You know, I always say try to make it the first thing for next year, and to really be ahead of the game, and to really make sure you're fine-tuning. The other piece is to really make sure you have a very strong, very specific ask, so that you know how much it is. You can say what it's for. You can say why you need it, why it's critical. And then also talk about what the benefits are. Like what are we as a state, as a society, really getting out of it, getting for it? What's the societal benefit? Really, you know, oftentimes I see a wide spectrum of budget asks, but I really feel the stronger and the more detailed your budget ask is, the better the ask. Really, the better the chance of being able to get it done. The other thing that I would also say is you want to work with legislators. One thing I changed about the budget process, it used to be, before I became budget chair, really everybody approaching our house, they just go straight to the speaker's office. They would go straight to the speaker himself to really ask for a budget augmentation. I really changed that and encouraged advocates to work with legislators, whether it's one or two or many, to ask for items in the budget. I think it's much more effective when you have them working with you. They're your best advocates, they're your best fighters, and they're also the people that we're working with the most every single day. It's easier for us to have conversations with them than all of you, just because we see each other a lot more and we're conversing a lot more. So I really encourage all of you to think about that. So again, thanks so much for coming today. Really appreciate it. If you want to march in Pride, we always have a Pride contingent Sunday, June 25th. Talk to Mark. We always are looking for more people to be in our Pride contingent. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming today. Really appreciate the nice turnout, and appreciate all the folks coming.